There are a lot of arenas where we are not that visible, and there is still a lot of work that remains to be done. So I think we do have a lot to go to reach that point where Sámi would properly have a say and decision-making power about issues that impact our lives.
Welcome to the We Need to Act, the podcast about the people, ideas, and movements shaping a better now. I'm Sarah, your host, an academic and sustainability professional who believes that understanding the world is the first step to changing it. Each episode, I sit down with extraordinary guests from around the world: scientists, activists, indigenous leaders, entrepreneurs, and thinkers who are doing the work and living the change. My guest today is Áslat Holmberg. Áslat is from Njuorggán, which is situated on the banks of the great river Deatnu, which today forms the border between Finland and Norway. He's a salmon fisher, teacher, and holds a master's degree in Indigenous studies. He's a former member of the Sámi Parliament of Finland. As of 2021, Áslat served as the president of the Saami Council in the period between 2022-2024 and works with various processes dealing with Indigenous knowledge and rights. Thank you, Áslat, for joining us on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to have you with us. And I wanted to start with a question. Well, you are a member of the Sámi people, a member of the Sámi Parliament in Finland, and the former president of the Saami Council. And to start us off, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey?
Yeah. So I'm a former member of the Sámi Parliament as well. And yeah, should I say? I mean, I'm from the village of Njuorggán or Njuorggán, which is the northernmost village on the Finnish side of the territories. I live in the Deatnu River valley, so I'm looking at the river just from my window there, and on the other side is what is today called Norway. But my family comes from both sides of the border, and for Sámi, the state borders are not that significant. So yeah, I grew up here. I've lived most of my life here. I grew up fishing in the river, mostly salmon fishing. So that is something that has been following me through my work life. So I've been quite active in the politics for more than a decade now, working a lot in the International Indigenous Peoples Movement. I've been working with the Biodiversity Convention for over a decade. Yeah, I mostly work with the Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous knowledge, Sámi culture, and I'm also a big traveler. I like traveling, so I get home from a long journey. But yeah, it's good to be
An explorer, I see.
Yes, I'd say so.
And you mentioned the river, and when you mentioned the river, there was something about it. So can you tell us a little bit more about this connection with the river?
Yeah, well, yeah, as I said, I grew up fishing salmon in the river. So basically I think I was 2 years old when I first went fishing with my father. Probably I was not much help at the time, but when years passed by, I started being more and more help and less of a nuisance. So we were fishing together with my father for yeah, I guess it's like almost 30 years together. And yeah, to me, it has been a big part of my life because it's been also a way of getting food directly from nature. It has been also part of the traditional economy, been exchanging salmon to reindeer meat, for example. And it has been a big part of my self-sufficiency. That is something that, especially the older generation here had they valued it very high. Like you have to be able to get at least some of your food, and you have to fill your freezers before the winter comes, so that you will not be dependent on others. Yeah, it's about self-sufficiency. Of course, fishing is also a big carrier of culture. It carries a lot of language and knowledge. I've gotten a lot from the fact that my father taught me to fish in the river. And of course, now that I've been working in politics. So we are talking a lot about rights to the fish, rights to the river, as well as climate change and everything that is related to that, and how that is reflected in the river. So we have gone through some very dramatic changes here in the decade, or especially 5 years. So it's definitely a window to an Arctic or subarctic ecosystem in rapid change.
Yeah, it's across the world, but yeah, in Arctic we can see it more. And the Sami people are, I would say, the only indigenous people of Europe. Yet many Europeans still know very little about them. It was not that long that I discovered. Uh, and I'm from Europe. So, and I've been working also closely to these issues. Why do you think awareness is so limited, and where has the system fallen short?
Well, of course, we are relatively small numbered. A rough estimate is that there are about 100,000 Sami. So, looking at the total population of Europe, then we are a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And of course, since we are indigenous people, and by definition, we don't have our own state, so then we are not that visible in those arenas where, let's say, all the European nation states are represented. And it is a bit odd because also Sami are one of the most researched people in the world. So there has been a lot of interest, like anthropological interest towards the Sami. For European researchers, Sapmi is relatively close by, so it has been quite easy to come here. So that would kind of make you to assume that people do know a lot about Sami. But I guess yeah, there are a lot of arenas where we are not that visible, and there is still a lot of work that remains to be done. For example, towards the European Union, and I think it's possible build more visibility and have more voice also through that arena. Yeah, I guess the average European might learn more about Native Americans in school than about the Sami people. So I think there might be something that could be done in that regard also, like perhaps include half a page or a couple of pages about indigenous people in the north of Europe.
Yeah, and then we should also be proud of it to be preserving, to have like a community of people, indigenous people that are preserving their culture. And this is like a debate, that we are Europeans and we have each one of us from different countries, but then there is this debate surrounding if we are Europeans, we are losing our cultures to be more aligned with Europe and the globalized world. But I think there is space for everything, and we should acknowledge the existence of indigenous people and what they can bring to the table, and invite them to the dialogue, as you said. And especially important nowadays because we are living this big environmental crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, and we know that indigenous people are the ones preserving the ecosystems. So Sami communities were also subjected to assimilation policies as other indigenous communities in different places around the world. And nowadays you have like a political system, parliaments and Norway, Sweden, Finland, and with also legal protections for language, culture, traditional ways of life. From your perspective, is this progress enough?
Yes, I think there is a lot that remains to be done in terms of representation and safeguarding Sami rights and effective participation in the various political processes that we have. Like we do live in the Nordic countries. In the case of Finland, it's also part of the European Union. So there is ocean of processes that some of them, many of them do somehow impact also the Sami people. I guess especially in the border areas, and a lot of the regulations, restrictions, they might have to do with the borders and how the border communities are impacted. But more generally, I think there is a lot of capacity that is needed in this world where we are supposed to be able to monitor all the processes that will have some impact on the Sámi. And if we look at the Sámi Parliaments, it's hard to generalize because they are quite different from country to country in terms of capacity, resources, and even the legal standing and responsibilities. But in the case of Finland, as an example, Parliament is mainly an advisory body. So even when there are decisions, let's say legislation that has to do with land use or that impacts traditional livelihoods or culture, or education, then the Sámi Parliament does not have any real decision-making power. They have the power to decide whatever they want to prioritize, what are the goals that they want to work towards, what are the changes they want to propose to different legislation, but it's always the state that makes the final call on that. If we are to look at the international human rights framework and what is the founding block, you could say, of international human rights law is the right of all peoples to self-determination. So I think we do have a lot to go to reach that point where Sámi would properly have a say and decision-making power about issues that impact our lives. So I think we still have a lot of this colonial legacy to unfold and decolonize our societies as well as the majority societies in the countries where we live. And also as I mentioned, the European Union, I think also the Sámi don't have permanent voice. There is no permanent representation in Brussels. So I think that's also a gap that we need to fill, because there is a lot going on also in Brussels that impacts the Sámi. So we need to have an effective presence there and participation in these processes that also should respect the right of Sámi to take part in these processes as an indigenous people in Europe.
Do you think governments are open to it? Of course, they are reluctant, I'm sure.
Well, we do live in a world that is very state-centric and, I guess more and more also corporation-centric. But let's say the main building blocks of this system are the states. So for an indigenous people, it is a bit hard to find the way into these rooms, because it is the states that have the right to vote in these processes and participate, whether we talk about the European Union or the United Nations. So yeah, definitely it is challenging also to find a way what would be the right presence for a non-state people to take part in these arenas. And I think there is some openness. If we look at the European Union, for example, then I think there is some openness to strengthen the Sámi presence and participation in the processes, but it is still quite modest, and the ambition as well as the actions could be upscaled quite strongly.
Right. And you also mentioned education in a way, and I'm curious, as Finland is like top in education, in leading this part. Is it, do you teach children or have that on the curriculum about the Sámi people?
Well, what comes to the national curriculum, then far as I know, there is next to nothing about the Sámi. So it is left quite strongly to the individual schools. And I mean, there is a lot of room for moving around there. Like, for example, these schools in the north, in the Sámi territory, they are able, and often they do include some like local history. And obviously, if you live in a Sámi community, then you be learning about the Sámi more than in the south. But yeah, I think when it comes to your average Finnish school, then you can go through the whole school system without hearing a word about the Sami, or maybe even hearing just in passing something that might be stereotypical, or and it's a big issue because most, I think it's about 80% of Sami children and youth who live outside Sami home area, which means that they are in this Finnish school system and they might be invisible in that system. And often it can be so that the Sami student or pupil, they become the teacher when it comes to Sami issues. So we also a lot of pressure for a child to be representing a whole people and expected to know a lot and share a lot.
That's true. And how is the Sami way of life?
That's a broad question.
Yeah, that's true. But just to enlighten that someone, our listeners, just how do you go by? Is it normal? Other people? Do you have specific traditions?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on where do you live. And I mean, I live here in the Sami territory, and this is the northernmost municipality in Finland, and it's the only municipality in Finland with a Sami majority. So I think our situation here is quite different to most other Sami because, for example, this like the municipality is mostly, the politicians are mostly Sami because we democratically elect the people there. Yeah, what could I say? I mean, we of course live in a modern world, so we drive our cars and snowmobiles, and many people do have an office job, or they might work in the service sector, or have an average 9 to 5 kind of job. But also here in the north, there are a lot of people who do work with reindeer herding, for example. I think that is the most important, like primary occupation that people actually full time and are actually making their living by herding reindeer. And that is also lifestyle I halfway grew up with. We used to have here when I was a kid. But yeah, also for those people who might have more of an ordinary job, then I think for many it's still important to do these kind of traditional activities. For example, here in the Deatnu River Valley, fishing, it's still important. It used to be much bigger part of people's lives. So yeah, people go to the river to get at least part of their food from there. It's an important part of our life to maintain relations with the environment, and we mostly do that through the traditional occupations or practices. Yeah, I mean, we live quite a modern life. We have houses, and we vote in the state elections, and we watch television and scroll too much Instagram. And I think a lot of our life is similar to your average
Right.
Europe life,
Yeah.
but still, I mean, we do have we have our own languages. So here, the common language for Sami is the North Sami. So whether you're from the Norwegian side or Finnish side, then yeah, we talk the same language. And of course, there are also a lot of Sami who don't speak the language, but yeah, it's still existing and being used in everyday life. Also, the kids go to school to learn the Sami languages. We have several different languages. But yeah, what else do I know how to say? Like I said, it's a very very broad
Yeah,
question.
yes.
Maybe I
It was just to enlighten listeners regarding your ways of life, and not that I don't want people to think like you are outsiders. You live like in communities away from the rest of the world. No, you are part of the system. You are Europeans as well, but you have a different connection with the environment, with nature. You maintain your traditions in a way and your culture, and you keep your language alive, and that is part of who you are. And you have been more impacted certainly by what is happening with climate change, and especially what is happening in the Arctic. I remember we had a past episode with Dr. Sarah Alsbeek. Do you know her?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So we talked about what is happening in the Arctic. And how is this impacting your ways of life, your traditional livelihood?
Yeah, well, it's impacting very, very drastically. And if I start by telling about the river, since I already mentioned in the beginning, we are now about to enter the 6th year of complete closure of the salmon fishery. So that is to give you some idea of the scope of the change that we are going through, because salmon used to be the most important resource in the region. So it was the core part of the traditional economy. And yeah, people used to have salmon basically year around. So from the time that we finish fishing, we have enough fish to last until the river opens again. And now, let's say 7 years ago, 8 years ago, the salmon stocks really started plummeting, going down very drastically, and they haven't recovered. So 2 years ago was the lowest point in the number of salmon that are returning here. There are like sonar monitors in the river, so we have an estimate of how much fish comes to the river, and I think we are at about 1% of what would be the ideal situation in terms of salmon numbers. So we are really at the low end of the wave. Like there has been fluctuation in the salmon stocks throughout history, but never this kind of a constant low. So yeah, it has resulted in this closure of the fishery. So people are not able to practice that anymore, and it has completely changed the lives of people in a sense that for lot of folks around here, then they used to spend a significant part of the summer fishing, being on the river, and yeah, being active. It's like the fresh air, and you're getting also exercise and also healthy food. So also the diet has changed as a result of that. And yeah, well, basically we are witnessing erosion of also the knowledge, because yeah, we consider Atlantic salmon to be very smart fish. So it's not easy to catch it. You have to know a lot. You have to know a lot about the salmon, about the water, about the streams, different qualities of the river, as well as the equipment, like how to use what kind of equipment, how to repair it, how to set it up. So now that we are going into the 6th year of closure of the fishery, that we already have a generation growing up who have not been used to going on the boat. It's not part of their like yearly cycle to go in springtime and prepare the boats and then go fishing throughout the summer. So yeah, it has really changed here. Like the river used to be very active before. There were boats. Almost every house had their boat by the river, but nowadays it's quite rare to see a boat in the river. It's really quite silent during the summer. So yeah, that is one impact of climate change. Like we cannot pinpoint an exact reason why the salmon are not returning, but the research points towards something drastic happening in the ocean, so that the salmon juveniles they're not returning from when they migrate to the ocean. Then they're and most likely they die on that journey. And also we have experienced a shift in the fish species in the river. Like the Atlantic salmon has been replaced by another salmon, the salmon. So yeah, which is very different in terms of its life cycle. It behaves very differently, and it's also very numerous. So that would be a
Is
way
it
for us.
an
Yeah,
invasive species?
that is a word that some people use, but yeah, it was introduced in the Russian side in the Sami territories, I believe in late 60s and 70s. And for some reason it has now been increasing a lot in numbers, and they're finding new rivers. So most of the rivers by the coast of Norway, as well as all the way to Greenland and Iceland, they are experiencing big runs of pink salmon. So yeah, it is also part of this radical shift we have experienced, that the pink salmon is well, it comes every other year. So not every year, but those years that it comes, it is the most numerous fish in the river. So we have witnessed this change in the basically dominant fish species in the river. And yeah, if I'm to also say a few words about the impacts of climate change to reindeer herding, it differs a lot from year to year. And there were moments this past winter that were more like the good old days when we had like really cold, minus 30 degrees Celsius. And, yeah, for many reindeer herders, this was pretty good winter. But then when we compare it to last winter, a year ago, then that was really abnormal. So we had rain every month of the year, which never used to happen before. Like we never used to have rain. It was very rare in December, never happened in January, February. But yeah, now we don't have this period without rain. So what that means is when we have snow and then we have rain and plus degrees, so then the snow melts and basically there is ice everywhere. Then it means that the reindeer are not able to access food more and more. Reindeer herders need to feed the reindeer. That has been a practice in my region already for many decades. There are a lot of communities that don't really feed the reindeer, but they have had to start supplementary feeding them because the reindeer would die without any food because everything is frozen. So yeah, there have been some very drastic changes also impacting the annual cycle. Like some reindeer herding communities, they are migratory, so they have different grazing lands for the winter, for the spring, for the summer, for the autumn. So it's also impacting when the seasons are changing and mixing together. So it's also impacting how do you use the territory. And in some cases, communities have had to move to the summer grazing land already at winter time because it has been too difficult logistically to feed the reindeer in the winter grazing lands. So yeah, there have been really big changes, and also the warm summers are impacting the reindeer also because there are big changes in the insects. We used to have like one period for mosquitoes and one period for, I don't know what you call it in English. Anyway, there's a smaller insect and then even smaller ones, and then we have the horseflies and whatnot. So they did not used to come all together, but now they are there at the same time. Yeah, and on some summers it's really, we have tons and tons of mosquitoes and other insects, so they are also impacting the reindeer. So there is the heat stress as well as the insects that are not letting them to graze in peace, and that is also impacting how they manage to get fat during the summer season. And yeah, so there are very big changes happening here.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that it is in a way make you, I wouldn't say apart from nature, distancing, because younger generations nowadays are not living the way you used to live before. There are not the same amount of fish in the river. They don't go to fish with their parents. They don't have the experience. So that kind of is making us apart, pushing us away from nature to experience that. Is there any lessons regarding how your connection, the Sami people, with nature that you would like to share?
Well, I think there is a lot in like the traditional worldview of the Sami, and I don't claim that that is the situation or that that's like the guiding rule for every Sami, but I think there are these rules in our culture that can be very useful in terms of basically conserving the ecosystems that we all rely on. So for example, these very basic instructions that define the position of human in terms of the ecosystem. So one is that in the traditional worldview, we don't consider human to be above other forms of life. We are not above animals. So it is very opposite of the Christian worldview, for example, which is man is here to dominate the other species, basically, and in many cases other people also. But yeah, in the traditional Sami worldview, that is not the case. So we are just one part of the ecosystem, one species among others. And I think that should bring you a level of humility also, and respect, which can go far. And then if we look at this kind of guiding principles in the traditional worldview, then we have this habit or a rule of asking for permission, pyytyslovi. So that's something that traditionally Sami do, let's say, whether we are talking about setting camp in some place, whether we're going hunting or fishing or visiting somebody or whatever it is, there is this rule of asking for permission. Like, are we welcome here? Can we be here? Can we stay here for a while? Yeah, if you get the permission, if you feel you're welcome, then also there is habit leaving the place in the same or better condition as it was before you came there. So that is also part of the tradition of not leaving signs or marks in the nature. If we are to look at these Sami territories, then you will not find pyramids or like huge structures. Like basically, the only historic signs of life are, like, you can see in some places the ground is a little bit going down because they used to be the traditional turf huts built there. And also, you'll find some stone structures to mark the borders between the villages, and also some holes that were used for hunting deer before the reindeer became the dominant animal and practice here. So yeah, it has been part of the Sami culture of not modifying the nature, and also basically removing your signs. Let's say if you had a fence around your house that you don't need anymore, then you are supposed to take it out and not just leave it there. I think it's a valuable approach to consider, not to modify the surroundings, or if you do that, then you should like unmodify it or make it how it was before you were using them.
Yeah, showcasing the interconnectedness of everything when you harm something outside. As we are nature itself, as Casey Kamp-Hoyenek, a previous guest from the Ponca Nation, said. So if you modify something outside, it will have an impact within. And I'm also curious to know, you are something more personal. You are from a younger generation. What motivates you to follow traditions and be connected to your roots?
Yeah, I think there are many aspects to that, and part of that I live here,
Of
where
course.
my family is from, where my ancestors are from, and I want to live here also. So there is that feeling that I don't want to go somewhere else, or like this is where my life belongs in a way. And I think to a big extent it has to do with what I was talking before about this self-sufficiency, or basically, in other words, the ability to live here, to be able to sustain yourself, survive if you wish, which is a brutal word. But anyway, yeah, so learning how people used to live here, how can you actually make a living in this relatively harsh subarctic environment. So there is such wealth of knowledge on how to make a living in these areas. And of course, I am from younger generation, and I mean, I've had an office job for quite a few years, so it's not I'm out there hunting on a day-to-day basis. But still, like, I get, yeah, basically all the fish that I eat, I catch it myself. And also I try to trade the meat that I consume, and I am working towards hunting more. So there is this desire to have the knowledge and skills that I can actually live here without, of course, I don't dream of the world without a paycheck. I mean, I'm not against work or working
Yeah,
in an office or whatever, if you're working in a school or whatever it might be.
just finding balance.
Yes, yes. So having this kind of balance that I'm not completely reliant on what they have in the shelves of the store, so that I can do something here and not to be reliant on others. And I mean, also it's about part of this kind of continuation of tradition and culture and language. So I don't want to be the one who kind of stops
Yeah,
these traditions. So I feel like it's my responsibility to work towards protecting Sami rights, indigenous people's rights, culture, language. So it's a whole way of life. It's about the Sami people. It's of course, it's a sense of belonging and working towards something greater than yourself. And also, as you mentioned, this interlinkage between indigenous peoples and conservation. So again, I'm not claiming that that is how we all live nowadays, whether it's a Sami or who. But I think there is a lot in this uh, worldview of the Sami that if you live accordance with these teachings, then you are at the same time you are safeguarding the environment and using it sustainably. So that is also part of the motivation, seeing this very unsustainable way of life globally with the consumerism and globalization. Also seeing our part in this bigger picture in being able to live in our areas and use the resources we have in a sustainable manner. At least that's a goal to strive towards.
that's great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And this has been a really enlightening conversation. And as an European, I thank you for what you have been doing to preserve Sami people. At least I will make sure to pass the knowledge to my son. What I learned, that there are some people in Europe that have their tradition and are doing their best to connect with the environment and to preserve it. And do you have any final words you would like to share with our listeners?
I think I said already a lot. So, no,
Any co-
well, of course, we live in a very strange time in many senses, and like having used so many years of my professional career working with human rights issues. So I think it's quite important to see this, in a way, interconnectedness of human rights and how they are for everybody. You cannot like pick and choose, like, okay, let's have a human rights for these people, because that's not how it works, because that's how the whole system will erode. So I guess just to draw the link to the Sami struggle and Sami people is that then this desire to work towards a world where there are some kind of rules that govern the interactions between different nations, and also that guarantee rights for communities, for individuals, for peoples. I do want to give this call to action towards working towards protecting the human rights system as it is. And it's a system that was created to avoid basically war between nations. I think that's
Yes,
something that many people might forget, having lived these times of peace. So I think remembering that this is about having some kind of rules to ensure peaceful coexistence between nations, but also between people and the environment. So these are very important principles and tools that we need to fight, not to lose them.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it has been a great pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation.